My next guest is Tom Chi. He's one of the founding members of Google X. Tom's innovative thinking paved the way for extraordinary projects like Google Glass, Project Loon, and self-driving cars. He is a regular speaker at TED, Singularity University, and Mind Valley. And more recently, Tom's focus has shifted towards At One Ventures. He has raised over $450 million, all dedicated to aiding humanity in becoming a net positive to nature. But what I'm specifically inspired to talk to Tom, and the reason why I'm excited to have him here today, is his commitment to continue to nurture and guide other impact entrepreneurs. He's taken on the mission to teaching us how to approach complex global issues in systematic and tangible ways. And whether it's through his enlightening TED Talks or on our interconnectedness, or his philosophical musing on the existence of God, to me, Tom's insights are profound and thought-provoking. He has an uncanny ability to make world-changing ideas seem not only possible, but within our reach. Welcome to Noble Warrior. Thank you so much for being here, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here today.
Yep. So I wanted to first start off by asking you this question about your near-death experience and what you learned from that.
Sure. Yeah. So it happened when I was 29 and about like 3 months before my 30th birthday. But to understand the incident, you need to understand the context before it, which is I had been working at Yahoo, been raising up the ranks relatively quickly. I think I got like 5 promotions in 4 years kind of thing. So I was working at a very senior level inside of Yahoo. And up until that point in my career, I had a very specific way of becoming successful, which is as a person who had a lot of personal capacity. And if I, put in a little bit of extra work, I might be able to generate the output of 3 people or 4 people, that kind of capacity difference. And early in my career, then it meant that when challenges would come up, I would just work extra hard and get it done. And then people would give me more challenges. And when I started running teams, then I would use that excess capacity, where I would get my job done. But as I went around to the different team members, if they were overstretched, like maybe they were, booked 130%, well, I would take 30% off their plate so that, they could get back into their kind of like optimal ability to deliver and everything would still get done, but I would just kind of take on a bit of that responsibility. And that worked for a bit because when you have a 5-person team and you have a bit more capacity than most folks to get stuff done, then you can easily take 20% from this person and 30% from that person and not kind of explode. And then it was still working when I had a 20-person team, but by the time that this all happened, my team was not quite 50, but it was like on the way to 50. And when you start taking 20% from this person and 30% from that person, and it basically became way more than one human being could do, even with extra capacity. And I didn't recognize how stressed I was at the time, but in retrospect, I recognized a bunch of stress behaviors that I was exhibiting. Like I would go into work, first thing in the morning, I would go to the cafeteria, fill up a 24-ounce cup with ice chips, and basically chew on ice all morning as I was just kind of plowing through work items. And I understand in retrospect that was a major like stress management behavior, and that in practice I was internalizing all this stress that was actually hurting my body quite a bit. But I was like so focused on the mission, I was effectively neglecting it. And just like stress can be associated with gastrointestinal problems, ulcers, all that kind of thing. Something like that was basically happening for me, but in the lower GI tract. And it was the holiday, I was home for the holidays and when I was 29, and all this was kind of happening at work. and I was hanging out with some of my old friends from high school and just like playing video games or whatever. It's like how we catch up just by doing the stuff that we did when we were in high school. And I remember like going up to go to the bathroom and I actually collapsed in the hallway before I even got to the bathroom, because what had happened is that basically something effectively exploded in my lower GI tract, and I was massively internally bleeding. And luckily, my friends like heard the thud in the hallway. They called the ambulance. I ended up in the hospital, about 20 something minutes later. And from the outside, it wasn't clear what was wrong because the bleeding was all happening internally. But once they actually took my vitals, then like a very like alarmed face came over, the nurse and the folks that were taking the vitals, and they basically called in a bunch of people, super quickly, because effectively what had happened is I had lost about 40% of my blood in the intervening 30 minutes between that time I collapsed and the time that they recognized what was happening. And they did 4 simultaneous blood transfusions, because if it was a little bit of bleeding, then you could do a single blood transfusion and probably stabilize. But I had lost so much blood and I was actually so close to dying that they had to do 4 simultaneous. And then after those 4, they had to do another 4. And that stabilized me enough, but then I still had to do 2 more transfusions, over the night before I could wake up the next day. But that moment when, right before the transfusions were started coming in, like I could actually feel myself dying. Like I could feel my extremities going cold. Effectively, what happens is that when you're in that dying process, then your body gives up on everything. So it'll give up on obviously your limbs first. It'll give up on all the internal organs other than your heart and your lungs. It'll basically say, well, we need that stuff to keep going, but everything else we can shut down, including your brain. So, I found out the next morning that I was about, 60 to 90 seconds away from irreversible brain and organ damage, where, you basically die shortly after that. But that entire process, I could feel myself dying. And I remember having a very strong sense of returning, which was a whole thing I needed to go look into after I came back from dying. But, when actually was saved through the transfusions and I woke up the next morning, I realized a couple different things. I realized that number one, I was only alive because of the generosity of 10 folks that I was never going to be able to meet or thank. And, that had a lot of leadership lessons in it, in terms of, you think that you are going it alone and it's like all about your merit and all that kind of thing. But really, we are held up and we support each other in countless ways. And most of them are invisible or they're easy for us to forget. But occasionally, something like a blood transfusion, obviously tangible, visible, obvious that you're being supported by others. But that like strong sense of being supported by others, allowed me to see all the other ways that you're supported by others, even though we have this kind of hero mythos around, the single person putting in the long hours to get the amazing thing done, blah, blah, blah. And then, the other realization is that human beings are mostly liquid, and, most of that liquid is blood. And that morning I woke up with mostly other people's blood. So that morning I mostly woke up as the majority of my mass was other people. And there's just this kind of, so that like concept of being supported by other people, at least that morning, was not just abstract. It was literal, concrete, right? Like my body was still running because of a more than half contribution of other people. And to be kind of held in that way, as opposed to feeling like I needed to like take the work off, take the stress off of all these team members and kind of hold them, then that was a very powerful kind of realization as well.
Mm, that's really beautiful. I heard you tell this story before. Now, back then, were you ever a spiritual person, or you just had this, more of a spiritual type experience since the near-death experience?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit mixed. So my mom is a Buddhist and my dad's an atheist, but because my mom's Buddhist, then I spent, time in, the Buddhist temples and, learned to do some meditation when I was younger, learned some of those principles when I was younger. But I didn't really consider myself to be particularly spiritual, though I am a person who's interested in, what things mean and, how people form meaning. And there's obviously a lot that spiritual traditions have done, on those fronts, though there are other ways to explore meaning other than spiritual traditions as well. But as like a student of the larger sense of how people create meaning. But, practically speaking, most of my career up until that point was as a scientist, engineer, technology, product leader, that kind of thing. And those are disciplines that tend to be highly logical, highly structured, don't necessarily have as much room for some spiritual principles like, faith or the belief in something greater than yourself. Things are relatively mechanistic, like here's a delivery schedule, this much will be produced in this much time as code, as physical material to go deliver this to those people. So it was definitely a different category of thought than where I was spending most of my time most days.
Got it. Well, I mean, this reflects back to my experience personally. My friend calls me spiritual rationalist.
Hmm.
So my training is in biomedical engineering, PhD, or everything. And until I had my first mystical experience, if there's no data, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
That was the way that I think about the world back then. And then I had my ayahuasca experience. I had a mystical experience. I saw, the visions that I saw. Then I realized the limitations of rationality, and where spirituality began for me personally. So it was a pivotal moment for me. I still remember that specific moment exactly. Has it ever, since that moment, since that incident, have you had similar type of epiphany generating experience for you to really look at um the material realm, this reality, as well as the spiritual realm, anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. I have a lot of different frameworks that allow space for things. You know, the first one is exactly what is a spiritual practice, and a lot of times people think about spiritual practice according to very specific traditions, like, oh, in the Buddhist tradition, then this is spiritual practice, or in the Judeo-Christian, some Judeo-Christian context, then this is what spiritual practice is, or an indigenous practice, then here's what spiritual practice is. But like the way that I kind of redefine spiritual practice is it's anything that, lifts your spirits. So, because for example, I'm a musician and I know that there's moments where I'm like playing with a band or like producing a piece of music and it's like really just got into it's like created a moment that like so strongly lifts your spirits, like kind of brings you to a completely different space and perspective. And this is why, for musicians, music can be a spiritual practice. For dancers, dancing can be a spiritual practice. And you see this kind of woven into the historical traditions where, yeah, in a lot of churches, in a lot of spiritual contexts, then there will be music or sound, whether it's the shaman, like, banging the drum at kind of a steady pace, or whether it's a gospel band, kind of doing their thing and like backing a choir and doing something really amazing there, or whether it's like, the songs of devotion that people sing in various spiritual traditions. And when you open up the idea of spiritual practice to be any kind of ritual, any sort of activity that changes your spirits, like takes you from lower spirits to higher spirits, then you can see how a lot of things that we do are different forms of spiritual practice. And a lot of the things that people kind of talk about in terms of really grounding themselves or opening possibility through spiritual practice one can infuse them into what it is, even if you're a relatively secular person. So, if you're a secular person, but you love to go dancing, then there you go. There's a way that dancing can be your spiritual practice. If you're a secular person and, you love to like sing in a community choir, then there's a way that can become your spiritual practice, and a lot of other things as well. So that was an important understanding to me, because up until then, as a scientist, then you are way more likely to say like, well, where's the data? If I don't see the data, then what's going on? But like, there actually is data, but we haven't collected it systematically. But if you kind of went to a bunch of folks and you said like, hey, part of my spiritual practice is, giving back to the homeless, and you were to go interview them before they go do the spiritual activity, and you interview a cohort of them after they do the spiritual activity, and you could get data on that. You could say of 100 folks that went in and did that, then their kind of self-reported mood, sense of connection, sense of well-being have changed from a 3 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10, and across all 100, then, it averaged a 4.4 up to a, 7.2. And that would be data. Now, I think that, because we have not opened our aperture to understand spiritual practices that wide, then we just haven't done the work to go collect that data. But we know that anecdotally that people say things like that all the time, that the time that they spent giving back, or the time that they spent singing, or the time that they spent creating, really changed their spirits in a powerful way, just like the time that they might have spent at the synagogue, at the temple, like, these places. Obviously you can do that type of survey in those contexts as well. So this allowed me to like include a lot of things in the sense of what spirit was. And the near death experience was because I've not done any ayahuasca or a bunch of different things, 5-MeO, DMT, all that kind of stuff. But I've heard from people that have done it, and there's like, oh, this one basically creates a near death experience for you.
Mhm.
And having had a near death experience just in the normal way or in the unsafe way, I don't know how you want to say it, because it was,
Secular way.
yeah, it's a very unsafe way
Non-ceremony
to do
way.
it. Yeah, non-ceremony way, and actually, honestly, quite unsafe. Like, I literally almost died to have my near-death experience. But like, having had that experience though, oh, I understand why people would want to take a molecule to, or be in ceremony to have that experience, especially in a way that, you don't tease, yourself like 90 seconds from irreversible damage and death, right? So, so I get it, because on the other side of it, then my sense of perspective, connection, it kind of rewrote my understanding of what death was. A lot of it came from the exploring of that sense of returning. And that exploring of sense of returning is also the thing that kicked off the need to create the Everything is Connected talk, because I had actually been lightly planning that talk since the early 2000s, like 2003 or whatever. I didn't have my near death experience, until, yeah, a bunch of years later. And but like when that happened, then I was like, oh, I definitely need to write this talk. I definitely need to make this into some kind of thing, because that sense of returning, like what I realized when I parsed that sense of returning, it's like, well, what am I returning to? Like, what exactly does that mean? Because most people kind of, well, first off, like the actual feeling of dying was not a terrible feeling. So I think that's already an interesting observation, because I think our concepts of what it'll feel like to die are a lot scarier than what it actually feels like to die. Though, of course, I wasn't like part of some super violent death, like being, strangled or anything, but in terms of like what it feels like for your body to shut down in the very last bits, then honestly doesn't feel particularly scary. So that's one useful data point. But beyond, all that sort of stuff and the kind of concept of scariness of death, as I was parsing through the sense of returning, I was like, well, what does that even mean? I mean, I'm a physicist, I'm a person who like, understands that once an organism is kind of done, then yeah, at least that organism in that form is done. I mean, there of course like context of in different religious contexts, there's ideas of an afterlife, there's ideas of reincarnation, all that kind of thing. But, as somebody who was a lot more secular and scientific in my background, then I wasn't like leaning heavily on any of those sensibilities when I was feeling that sense of returning. And given that didn't have a big allegiance to any of those sensibilities, then I was like, well, what does returning mean? Like, what was I feeling? And I ultimately parsed out that the stuff that's actually in the talk, it includes things like, well, what am I exactly? I'm made out of atoms and protons, neutrons, electrons, that kind of thing. But where did those come from and where did they go? And it turns out that most of, the things that you're made out of, the protons, electrons, neutrons, are effectively immortal. They have been here since the beginning of the universe, and they are, the amount of time before a proton decays or an electron reaches its end of life, that kind of thing, is many billions of times longer than the age of the universe so far. So we're effectively these permutations on immortal stuff, like the same stuff that was kind of floating around in a gas cloud before it collapsed into our sun and our solar system is our stuff, which is the same stuff that had been kind of floating through the universe and, kind of coalesced not too long after the Big Bang. It's literally the same stuff, literally the same particles, because those particles don't really just die quickly and come back, right? Like, the protons, neutrons, electrons are very long lived. Neutrons are the most unstable out of the three, but even they have a half-life which is substantially longer than the age of the universe so far. So all the stuff we're made of is effectively immortal. It's like already gone through, tens of thousands of forms in different stars and different dust clouds and probably sloshed around, um, a bunch of different planetary systems before it actually became us in this planetary system. And even within this Earth context, then all the matter within the Earth is constantly cycling in and out. So, the stuff that is us is both immortal, but it's only a part of us for a very short period of time, days, weeks, maybe a year on the long side. Any specific atom is only a part of us for a very short period of time. So like we are both immortal, but we're also this kind of metabolic process. We're like this specially organized, burning candle flame, which goes and pulls in stuff and makes something of the stuff while it's all in our form. And then we release the stuff that is of us. Like a candle flame is different from second to second, and the atoms in our body are different from week to week. So we're just like a slow burning candle flame. So if the nouns, the actual atoms that make us up, are not the stuff of us, and really we're kind of the pattern of organization, like a highly organized candle flame through which the stuff comes in and the stuff goes out, then maybe the thing that we are is this pattern of organization. But then when you look at the pattern of organization, well, where does that come from? Well, a lot of our biological organization comes from our DNA. And that wasn't stuff that I made, right? I obviously literally inherited it from my parents, grandparents, all that kind of thing. Everybody has, all the way to the beginning of the origins of life on the planet. It's an unbroken chain from organisms that lived billions of years ago to us. Like there's no way that, DNA just like kept on spontaneously being invented from scratch. Like it's been a long unbroken chain for billions of years. So was that exactly me? I'm basically kind of like renting a bit of it or getting to participate in a bit of it, that of a system that I didn't create at all, but from which I'm getting all the benefits of billions of years of evolution and all the immediate genetic, pros and cons of parents and the culture that we're born into. So there's all this inheriting of the patterns that shape the kind of metabolic candle flame that we are. So it leads to this kind of this, all this type of, reflection led me to a type of like meditative comfort with what death is. Because on one hand, the material that makes me up is basically immortal. It's been around since the beginning of the universe. It's going to be around for a very, very long time. And the patterns of organization that had me come into a particular shape, and be in society in a particular form, are all very ancient, not as old as the particles in the universe, but also stretching into the billions of years, which means that there's honestly no way I could mess it up. And also that I'm always going to, the pattern organization that created me is also still highly extant, even if I am gone, this particular combination is gone. But it also kind of shows like the value of the special combination that you are in this life, right? Like you had a chance to go do the stuff that you are in this life, even if you've inherited 99.99% of the organization, and even if you've inherited 100% of the physical matter. But like it gives you that sense of, well, I'm riding on the shoulders of giants, and my life actually gets to add that 0.1% to the whole mix, as opposed to you're out on your own and you got to make your way, and it's a dog eat dog world, and hustle culture and just every kind of thing. It's like, no, no, no. What if like we already inherited the 99.9999%, right? And there is something for us to go add to it, but we will never need to lift the 100%. We
Mm,
honestly won't even need to lift the 2%.
mm,
Like even the most radical thinkers might be like 1% different than the norm.
mm. Well, I appreciate sharing that story. So here's what I love about that story is how you took a near-death experience. Most people get really emotional, really riled up about their experience. Like, oh my God, I almost died. Maybe they get a cool story to tell, once in a while. But I love how you think very broadly, very deeply, and the interconnectedness of just on the physical material sense, where all the molecules come from, and go back to the origin of those molecules from distant stars. And it did two things for you. That is what I got. One is give you tremendous sense of calm when it comes to this primal fear that almost all humans have around death. And two, also thinking about your role in continuing the legacy that is humanity, adding to the 0.1% or 1%, giving the short life that you have burning this candle. Is that an accurate reflection of what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. And just that deep sense of support. I mean, when you think about it, like people do say things sometimes where it's like, oh, I'm supported by my ancestors, and I'm getting a chance to like, work out things and live through things that they had wished to achieve or wished to have worked out. That's great. But like when people think about lineage as well, I think it's useful to understand that, obviously you think genetically, okay, roughly half of your genetics come from your mom, half of them come from your dad, a quarter from each grandparent, right? And that just goes back 2 generations. But if you scoot back 10 generations, then you actually got 0.1% of your DNA from 1,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
1,024 people.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 generations sounds extremely long, but if a generation is only 25 to 30 years, then 10 generations is only 250 to 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
So like 300 years ago, the stuff that is you came from over 1,000 people. And if you scoot back 20 generations, it comes from 1 million people. So like 500 to 600 years ago, then the stuff that became you were little bits from 1 million different people. Now, when you think about that, like when people understand their ancestors, they tend to think of just like the one patriarchal lineage or the one matriarchal lineage, what have you. And because of it, they reduce 20 generations down to like 20 people
Mm-hmm.
or 40 people. And I was like, no, guys, 20 generations is like 1 million people. And to understand that you are here because of the efforts of 1 million people, like really contextualize like how supported you are, all the way foundationally to the DNA that created you. So I think it just, the level of connectivity, I think people look at different coincidences and they're like, hey, we're connected, or they have a nice experience in church or some other spiritual setting, and they're like, hey, we're all connected. But like my realization after dying is that the level of support is so pervasive and so complete. It's almost like like it can't fit in your mind basically. How complete and large the level of support it is. And it's a real feat that we've created a society where people do not feel connected or supported. Like you
Mm,
really need to design it very hardcore to like not notice the thing that is basically you.
mm. There's a lot of directions I can take this conversation. I am curious because my whole thing is mental fitness, mental mastery, and neutralizing inner saboteurs. So when inner saboteurs are acting up, it's easy to feel I'm alone in this dog eat dog world. I need to make decisions for my own survival and thriving and all these things, right? It's easy to fall into that downward spiral. So in the moment of despair or challenge, great challenge, is this mental model, this narrative helping you to get back to like, no, this is a momentary loneliness, but I'm ultimately supported by millions of people, all my ancestors, and they're all here surround me. Like, can you bring us to maybe a personal example of how do you get yourself out of the I'm by myself, woe is me kind of state to like, no, that's incorrect. I'm actually supported by all of these people wanting to support me in my life.
Well, I think the intellectual construction of it is a good one to go have before you are feeling, in the depths of despair.
Hmm.
As like, the like having that logical frame and just knowing that's how the universe works broadly. And in my talk, I really associate I kind of tell three stories of connection. One is, having to do with our breath, one is having to do with our heartbeat, and one is having to do with
Mine.
our thoughts.
Hmm.
And I chose those things in particular because everybody has all three of those things all the time.
Hmm.
So it's, and it's to remind folks at a basic intellectual level that that every single thing that's happening every single second of their lives, like every breath, every heartbeat, every thought, is deeply interconnected. And if those three really foundational things are interconnected and they're not a special part of life, they are just the fabric of life, then knowing that to be like actually factually true, outside of anything you're particularly feeling, ahead of you starting to feel bad, gives you some scaffolding to be able to go crawl out because you kind of remember it. Now, if you didn't have that kind of scaffolding before you felt, a sense of despair, then a lot of it's just more related to practice. Like you can get folks to, be in a little bit of a different energy. And you can be the person that helps to get people in a little bit of a different energy. And, like the mind body system is very well connected. And when people get stuck in a tough loop on things, then a lot of times they're having a problem with their mind that they're trying to solve with their mind. They're having a problem with the body where they're trying to solve with their body. And sometimes that works directly, and that's great. If it works directly, then nothing else to say about it. But if it hasn't worked for a while, then I have a phrase which is like, if you are having trouble healing the mind, then focus on healing the body. And if you're having trouble healing the body, then focus on healing the mind for a bit. Not necessarily because that will always work, but it like shakes things up in a way that, you might not have tried yet. And a person that's been really down in the dumps, like sometimes they like, maybe their friend like convinces them to go take a weekend away and just like be in a different physical environment for a bit. And all they've done is change the setting around their body. And it has changed a decent amount. Like it's not as easy to fall into the same depressed patterns. And of course there are folks that their body has been, stuck in particular ways. And through the process of healing the mind, then they might unearth that there were some early life experiences that basically have them hold their body in particular ways as a form of protection. And now that those early life experiences, that danger has passed, then There are ways for their body to be able to not need to be on guard, not need to be, kind of contorted or disturbed by, something that has now psychologically passed. So there's a bunch of different, direct practice that come from it, but I like to share the logical foundations of it more for the mode when you have got the bandwidth to kind of receive it. I don't know that these are the specific practices that you use if you're already down in the dumps.
And since that near-death experience, and since having constructed this beautifully articulated physics-based mental model, have you explored further of what other narratives, maybe a spiritual belief or construct that help you further explore your own relationship beyond yourself?
Man, there's a lot, so one of the ones that you look at is what are the things that like are really making people dissatisfied? And a lot of times dissatisfaction comes from this like couple different sources. One is to go strive for things that you're not achieving, and therefore you're dissatisfied with yourself or life because the things that you're striving for are not, being achieved or being achieved at the pace that you want or in the way that you want, that kind of thing. And the framework that I have around that kind of dissatisfaction is the recognition that when people look back at their lives, then they define their lives by their tragedies and triumphs. But when you look into the triumphs tend to be triumphs because they are things that society has decided to value in a particular time period. So your triumphs are not necessarily yours in the same way that your tragedies are yours, right? The triumphs tend to be like, oh, I won the so-and-so spelling bee. And it's like, cool, that was nice. Or, I like won this tennis competition. Cool, that's nice. Now, if you did win that and whatever, you fast forward it to like whatever triumph goal that you had. Oh, I became the CEO of so-and-so and I made $1 million a year for the first of my life, right? These kinds of things. Whatever the construct of triumph, it tends to be built off of things that society values. And actually, a lot of dissatisfaction comes from either not being able to get to that triumph or getting to it and realizing that it wasn't really yours, right? You were chasing it because it was something that you were told that society values, and you were kind of trying to find value in yourself by getting to the thing that society values and hoping a bunch of it rubs off on you. So I would say that like that is one framework that has been helpful for people that get into these kinds of problems, because like that basic framework of the triumphs, it's I would challenge people to say like if you're dissatisfied with the framework of not being able to get to the triumph or the win that you are looking for, you should first step back and ask like, well, where did my desire to have this come from? Is it something that I just kind of blindly inherited from what society told me was, the triumphs I should care about? Oh, I need to graduate from an Ivy League school. If I don't, then I'm going to disgrace, all the educational work that my family has put in, da da da. Well, was that really yours? Or is that something, and sometimes it is, it's great. I'm not against the idea that you interrogate that and it's like, oh, I exactly want the thing that society told me to want. Great. But I'm going to say a lot of times, like well more than half of the times, people look at that and it's like, well, it's not exactly what I wanted. I mean, the thing I actually wanted was just to do blank, blank, and blank. And when you really kind of sort it out that way, a lot of times you can realize that there's a more direct path to doing the thing that you actually wanted. And when you get to that spot, then that sense of like gap or longing or needing to strive, which is kind of beating you down, then that is it lifts a lot because you start to see the shorter path to the thing that you actually want. The other sort of thing that tends to torture people is the sense that, outside of any specific goal, the way that you're living your life is not the way that you are wanting to live your life. And I think for that particular one, then it's a little bit of a similar process where you kind of interrogate a bit, where it's like, well, Is it that I'm actually, unhappy about the situation, or is it that I have not developed any skills around happiness? And that's a whole interesting interrogation. But sometimes you dig into that and you say like, oh no, I actually am unhappy with the situation. But then you can start digging into that process like, well, why am I in this situation then? And a lot of times you're in the situation for similar reasons to like the merit and triumph stuff, where it's like, well, I'm in a framework that society approves of more, or like, like in a template that society understands more easily. And even if it does not totally fit the way that I want to contribute to the world, then I've like, I kept my, investment banking job because like everybody is so impressed with it, right? And then like internally you're like dying inside. It's like, okay, well, that's not really the profession for you in the long run, but I get why you've like sustained this type of internal tension with yourself. And in that case, it's not even about getting the goal. Like you got the goal in that case, right? It's like, oh, you got the six-figure job and it's gone well. You made a 80% bonus last year and amazing, amazing. And also it's kind of like tearing you apart. So to the extent that you can get into that interrogation process, then there's a lot to be able to be kind of lifted there as well. But like just to go back to the previous point, sometimes we have not built the skills around happiness. And the phrase that I've, I kind of like came to my mind and I've been sharing with folks is that appreciation is more important than gratitude. So like, people are like, oh, you should come up with a gratitude journal and like every morning think of the things that you have gratitude for and write down three things. And obviously, probably everybody in your audience have like heard of a practice like this or done a practice of like this for some time. And I think that's fine. Like that is some good steps in a direction that can help with that with mental health and that sense of connection and that and like feeling like there's things that support you in life. But for me, appreciation is the verb that enables gratitude, right? So like even if I wouldn't put something in my gratitude journal, I like, because it's like it comes to mind as one of the top 5 things I'm grateful for in my life. And a lot of times you do those gratitude journals and the same sort of items will come up, and that's great. But appreciation is way more interesting. Appreciation is like, okay, here's a spoon, right? And it's like, well, what can I have the skill to appreciate a spoon for 3 minutes? And like, what is there to appreciate about it? And if one develops the skill to appreciate things, then there's a crazy amount of happiness on the other side of having that skill. Because, like, yeah, in a normal day, I might never think about this spoon. If I actually gave it a minute to like think about what I appreciate about it, then I would like start noticing things about like the weight of it in my hand and the fact that I've had it for 10 plus years and never had any issues with it. And, like the meals, the great meals that I've had with it over the years. Like there's a lot that comes forward, even in an everyday object that we would never give a second thought on, that like is either directly happiness or happiness adjacent. And it kind of moves your entire mindset into a completely different state. And because appreciation is the verb, as opposed to gratitude is almost like the indexing of a bunch of nouns, then the verb form of it is like alive and kicking and potent in a way that like, listing out things that you're grateful for. Because gratitude is at the end of the chain. It's like it's already done. I already know I like get a lot from my relationship to this person or this particular thing I like a lot. It's gonna make the gratitude journal. It's gonna make that top 5 of the things that broke through my mental awareness of things that are worth appreciating. But the verb of appreciation is a thing that eventually integrates to gratitude, and the ability to actually have, command over the verb. And at any given moment, it's like, oh, I'm stuck in the waiting room of this place where, I'm trying to buy something or I'm like waiting at the doctor's office or whatever. It's like a total bummer. And it's like, okay, well, let me use the verb of appreciation for a little bit. Like, what could I spend 1 minute appreciating in the situation right now or what's around me? And that will completely change things, even if those things would never hit your gratitude journal.
I love that. That's so great. I mean, a noble warrior, as you can tell, my background is the dojo. And so I use gyms and dojo, this type of metaphors a lot. And ultimately, it's about exercising the muscle of gratitude at the end of the day, right? How can
Yes.
I
Or
appreciate?
appreciation. Yeah. I use the verb, I use appreciation as the verb and gratitude as the state at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. So the skill of happiness ultimately comes down to, well, one of the skill is how we can appreciate a concept, a thing, and then the variety of different and infinitesimal ways that we can appreciate a thing. So what I want to tease out for our listeners here is this is a skill that we get to exercise. And to your point, the more muscle, the more masterful we are in appreciating a thing, a concept, a person, the more we can take that same skill to create infinite joy and happiness in our life. That's what I got from this. That was brilliant.
Yeah.
I
And
really,
and some of this, like, I got from being in the kind of like Buddhist temples and monasteries. It's like the folks actually physically own very little, but there's like so much appreciation for a meal. There's so much appreciation for, the care that somebody showed you, or I guess whenever I was there too, it's like they would like make me sweep floors and stuff because it's like you seem capable of things, so they could appreciate that I'm a person that could sweep the floor. So they're pretty good at that verb.
yeah. And then I want to circle back to your other point because you had mentioned achievement oriented, this type of mindset. I've recently read a book called Wanting, and that's
Mhm.
what the whole book is about. The author articulated in, you call it mimetic desires, what society, what others want for you. We want what
Right.
other people want versus an intrinsic desire, what we want ultimately.
Mhm.
And then, and then your point is to introspect, to think about, why do I want this thing? Do I want it because my parents want it, society want it, my wife wants it, my kids want it, whatever my peers want it, or is it that I truly desire? So I want to zoom in on that point real quick because the way you make it sound is really simple, but in my personal experience is often not that simple because I had to really think and contemplate, why do I want these things? Do I want a Lamborghini because all of my neighbors are driving a Lamborghini? Probably, right? And as soon as I move away from that neighborhood, I don't want that Lamborghini anymore,
Mhm.
right? But when you're in that environment, that desire seems real. So can you tease that out for us a little bit? Because, it's not, in my opinion, as simplistic as, hey, just do a meditation and ta-da, you'll have absolute clarity.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think you already pointed to something very important, which is if that desire would be 100% different when you're in a slightly different context, if you're in the neighborhood where everybody has a Lamborghini and you really, really want one, but if you were to, move over to a different neighborhood, then you wouldn't, then that actually shows something about the durability of that desire, right? And a lot of times, you look at some of the things like a good warning sign is, it's something that if you got it, everybody would approve of it, right? Everybody would be excited for you. Like those are the things that end up to be being a little bit more fraught because then, it's quite likely that part of the reason that you want it is for the approval of it. Now, I'm not saying that we should never do things for social approval. It's like we're part of a society. We should do some of that. It's totally fine. Like, I don't think that we can be in society without doing a little bit of it. But like when it comes to the things that really take over your life, then, don't necessarily have the approval of society be the thing that takes over your life or kind of infiltrates all the goals or creates a ceiling or a floor to your dreams. Like that's the place where it's kind of incurred beyond just the niceties of what it takes to be in a society. Now, you know, the thing that I kind of have come to, which has really helped a lot with it, is that also the idea of achievement, like these kind of like watershed or milestone moments where you've gone from the thing was not achieved to it is achieved, then I think that that actually is a lot more, comes from like a Western consumerist mindset on things. And, you know, I like occasionally will write a philosophical thing. And I think one of the things that I once wrote about this was, what if enlightenment was not something that could be obtained? It's just something, it's a verb that is practiced. So if you're practicing it, then you are enlightened. And when you stop practicing it, you aren't enlightened. And there is no state that is quote unquote achieved, right? Because when you achieve a state, then it's almost like I can check this off my bucket list of goals that are done, like milestones accomplished. And because of it, it's almost like I achieved it and that I don't need to be enlightened again. I achieved enlightenment. And like I started to realize like that was a very limiting frame for, and that's why, the bankers will go out there and it's like, oh, I had to quit my banking job and achieve enlightenment. Well, that's because they came from a very achievement driven frame in the first place. I think like one that is in some of those wisdom traditions, they recognize it's a lot more like if you practice, you'll have a glimpse of it. And if you stop practicing it, you will not have a glimpse of it. And you can be just as unenlightened as any other person on any given day, even if you have gotten a glimpse of it 50 times, in the last 50 days. Your 51st day, you could be an asshole and hey, you're not enlightened that day. So like it's not something that you're achieving. It's just a thing that one can practice or not. And actually, on one hand, that can seem defeating to people because they'll be like, I mean, I just wanted to check a thing off my list. I wanted to just practice, like get it done, and I'm enlightened now. I'm now like a fourth level master of so and so, as certified by this, enlightenment body or whatever. Like, give me my achievements. But I think like the thing that frustrates achievers about that thought is exactly the useful thing about the thought, which is that like, no, no, no. If you move it out of an achievement frame, if you move it into a practice frame where you are getting to choose whether to be enlightened and practice those skills or not in a given moment, then it is way closer to what it is to like truly make it something as part of one's life. As opposed to, I have a degree somewhere in a box somewhere that was like, or a couple degrees that are achievements. But like, am I doing literally that type of work every day that of what I studied? No, not at the current moment, not while I sit here on this couch. So like, given that it's like, well, am I that thing right now? No, not necessarily. I'm a person that's like, having a conversation with a person right now. That is what I am currently, doing, achieving. So like, I think if you start to understand life in that context, then you start to get a lot more focused on the quality of these moments as opposed to the like laundry, like the resume list that I can build up, right? Or the achievement list that I can build up. And the achievement list tends to be very abstracting and gets you out of the moments. And one that's focused on the quality of moments is, it's way more connecting and gets you into the moments. So like I actually wrote a goal for myself up on the board over there. I'll just like walk over to it
Sure.
because I think it's an example of thinking about it in that frame as opposed to an achievement based frame.
I love this. This is the first time a podcast guys is showing us some artifacts.
Yeah. So
This is
over
great.
here, it's like, so like my goal is to have a simple life of craft because for me, I'm a person who likes to be a craftsperson of a lot of different disciplines. And for me, my crafts are art, media, music, design, engineering, science, but to do that for purpose. And it doesn't say like any specific thing I need to achieve from all of that. It basically just says, if I'm living a life that is still in the craft of using these skills to do that, I'm going to be fine.
Mm,
Right. And there's something about that, that kind of framing where It allows you just to like reflect on the moment, which is, am I using my skills to do that kind of thing? Am I still in the craft of it? And being in the craft is a real interesting thing because it means that you have practiced enough that you can do something skillful and contributive. But it also means like to be in a craft, it means that you tend to be in the infinite journey of further learning of that thing, right? And I call them mastery disciplines. And literally everything in my simple life of craft is a type of mastery discipline. Like you could spend your whole life learning to be better at art or design. You could spend your whole life learning to be better at engineering, and there would still be more to do. Like my mastery, discipline description is like, imagine you're a person who fell in love with the guitar at age 5. And from the age of 5 until the age of 85, you like practiced, 5 hours a day, and it led you to an amazing life in guitar. And you got to go and play on the biggest stages and play with amazing groups and write songs that people, have heard and remembered. You've done everything that a person could do with a guitar. And if somebody were to talk to you, in your 85th year, and let's say you are, it turns out that you're near the end of your life and maybe you have a week to live, and you were to go talk to that person about their life with the guitar and ask them, wow, you've done 80 years of guitar. Is there any more for you to learn? A person that's in a mastery discipline will always say there's an infinite amount more to learn, right? Like even having spent like literally the longest that a person could do in a human lifetime on the thing, mastery disciplines are infinite in that way. And mastery disciplines, because they're infinite, they are partially a way to go defeat the sense of achievement milestones, right? Because if you are wedded to the getting or not getting of milestones, then there's a kind of boom and bust cycle. There's a type of, and like I say, it's like attached to a capitalist mentality as well, but put that aside for a second. But like this boom and bust cycle where you also like hype yourself up and get disappointed and feel like you're a failure because it didn't meet up to what you expected and all these kinds of things. Like there's all this other color that comes with it, which is not about being in the craft. And for me, the craft is actually already beautiful and joyful, right? If I'm writing music, it's already beautiful and joyful. If I'm doing engineering or design work, it's already beautiful and joyful. And, I want to be in like the craft zone. So the craft zone to me is like, in totality, whatever craft you're onto, you kind of think about it like a mountain climber. And a mountain climber typically has 3 limbs firmly planted and 1 always reaching. Right? That's how you actually climb a mountain. And the 3 limbs planted means you need to be solid enough in the skill that you can deliver something. Right? So there's a lot of people, it's like, oh, I love all these crafts. And they like try to learn music for 3 minutes. And then it's like, here's my crappy song. And it's like, no, their song is actually crappy. They don't actually have that much craft in this thing. Now, that said, it's fine. Like people got to start somewhere. But like, what it sounds like when somebody's in their first year of songwriting versus their 5th year of songwriting versus their 10th year of songwriting. The craft, the practice in it does matter. And that is the process of getting grounded and having like 3 limbs firmly planted. Those are the ones that are delivering. And then if you are in a craft, you'll always have 1 limb reaching. So it's like 25% of what you're spending time on in the craft is delivering what you are capable of doing so far. And then 25% is reaching for new stuff and 75% is delivering what you're good at so far. And I think if you can stay roughly in that ratio, then one can have a very long life in craft and basically, live a life that is supported by craft in a way that you are part of that infinite effort, part of a mastery discipline, as opposed to using it as a springboard for achievement.
Wow, that is a rabbit hole in itself. I love that. I'm huge on mastery. I'm a student of mastery. What you just shared, in my opinion, is the difference between a finite game and an infinite game, right? Finite game, you just want to, get to the final boss, you defeat it, all right, done, next game, right? You play a new game. Infinite game is, the point of it is so that we can continue to get to play this game, whatever game that we choose. I love the quote that you say, the quality of these moments becomes more important than the achievement itself. And I also wrote down what you said. By engaging in the craft, the act itself is already beautiful and joyful.
Mm-hmm.
I
Absolutely.
love that. So here because I love talking to virtuosos. That's my jam. That's my craft, right? This is my craft. This is my jam, and I love
Nice.
it. And and I also have met many of them that experience huge frustration because they want to achieve certain milestone, they want to play certain songs, they want to sing certain songs, they want to have a particular business practice that masterful way that I aspire to be, right? So in the moment of striving and they're out of the phase of beautiful and joy, um, do you have any tactical suggestions for them to get back to the state of joy and beauty rather than
Well,
frustration and striving and oh I'm not there yet and why isn't that on, you know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, like, remember the in the mountain climbing analogy, 25% is always reaching, but the nature of the reaching, can vary quite a bit. So if you're highly attached to milestones that must come from the reaching, then that can be a major source of dissatisfaction. But
Mm.
like, if, like I have a drum kit over there and I'm like learning how to play the drums better, and there's like various patterns out there. And like, when there's like a pattern of like coordination of your limbs that I've like not mastered before, that I'm like working on, getting the feel of, then that's the 25% reaching. Like it's not like you're not like flying. It doesn't sound amazing every time. Like you're like, whatever, your sticking pattern's a little bit off, like your feel of it is a bit off, all that kind of stuff. But like that tends to honestly not be a painful experience at all, right? Like to the extent that you're experiencing anguish or pain from it, it's because you've like attached further meaning to the 25% that is reaching and striving and saying like, oh my gosh, well, if I don't learn this sticking pattern, or if I don't learn, this groove within the next, 3 days, I'm going to totally fail at this gig or whatever. And that is actually the source of the things that get you out of that feeling of the moment of growing in your craft. Because I tend to think it, not just tend to think, it's like it's my lived experience that when you actually go and expand in your craft um, through the work that you do in a day, it honestly feels amazing. Even if it was like, okay, I had to practice that riff like 45 times and it was kind of repetition for 2 hours or something, but I kind of got it now, right? Like, did it sound like the best music ever for the 2 hours you're practicing it? Of course not, but did it feel like a tough experience? No, like there's like ways that it's clicking in with you and like ways that you're relating to it where it's like, okay, not quite this yet. Okay, that was perfect, except for like my left hand is coming in a little draggy on, toward the end of the pattern. Okay. And it's like, you're like in the craft of it. It actually feels like very engaging. There's a type of flow state that you can get for learning, just like there's a flow state that you can get for executing. And especially if the learning is like kinetic learning. Um, but even on intellectual tasks, like I'll sit down on some area that I'm needing to go like learn a lot more for my work. And I'll start the day with a certain level of knowledge. And by the end of the day, through research, cross-referencing, like writing a little Python script to like, give me a sense of how the numbers work, all that kind of thing. I exit the day with just a way like better qualified sense of what it is, that I set out to understand. And even if the day wasn't a performance day of like, oh, I delivered the thing that, people would pay to, ticket prices for, or like people would buy in my online course, or people would whatever, then no, it feels like a very satisfying like day of craft. And like to me, like that statement on the whiteboard is just to remind me that that is actually the reward feeling, The reward feeling is to have like lived my life in craft and have that feeling of, you know, these kind of moments of accomplishment and mastery that are associated with being in craft, as opposed to the accomplishments that, you know, I would want to put on in the front page of the New York Times, or talk to a reporter about, right? Like no reporter wants to hear like, oh, I worked on this sticking pattern on a Saturday for 3 hours and now I have a pretty good feel how to do so and so, right? Like that's not interesting to them. But like to me, like, and this comes to like, you know, what actual ways of living your life actually click for you, right? For me, I'm a person that's developed a lot of skills over life because I really enjoy this type of feeling of being in craft, learning in craft, and delivering things in craft. Like that feeling for me is kind of the North Star. And if I'm
Mm.
having that feeling a lot in my life, then everything is going to be fine, right?
I mean, hey man, this very point is one of the reason I knew I admire you in many different regards, not just your achievements, not just how you speak, not just your narratives, but but I think this very point that we're pointing to is, I let me know if I'm projecting, is the heart of all these other things, because you
Yeah.
treat life as a craft and you do it with joy and beauty. And in my opinion, these micro moments compounds over a lifetime to all these beautiful things that you created.
Yes, and I think that works for me because my kind of thing is a person that loves to learn, loves to create. And I think for other people, their craft might be connecting people, for example. And it's like, oh, to achieve what, right? But like, you know, put that aside for a second and just say, well, what would it look like for me to stay in the craft of connecting people? And maybe, you know, during their day job, then they're an event planner, right? But maybe like outside of that, they love holding dinner parties and all that sort of thing. That's them basically creating a whole life where they get to be in their craft. It doesn't need to be learning things to make things. That is basically a thing I found out about myself from, you know, the things that reflecting on the things I enjoyed more in life and the things that, you know, I felt more ultimately satisfied in life looking back on, compared to the big, you know, big achievements. So when I was young, I was a competitive chess player and I like won all these awards, but I like got, you know, would win this competition, win that tournament, da da da, and like have this trophy and come back. And that's not why I liked chess. So like whenever I would come home, I would actually just put it in a pile behind one of my trash cans, so in my room. So like, you know, it wasn't up on a shelf or whatever. Just like, well, I got another one. I mean, the thing that I liked in chess is like effectively like a living, breathing puzzle that is like unfolding in front of you and like fully engaging in the kind of intellectual depth of a puzzle that's unfolding, including, you know, the way that, you know, like the other players basically bringing different things to that puzzle. Like that to me itself is like its own kind of captivating little world that you can spend a decent amount of time in. And I remember like my mom and dad were very much against me like spending any time on chess because it's like, oh, that's a waste of time. That's not your studies. That's not, you know, even the extracurriculars that you could write on a college essay or whatever. Like that's like truly a waste of time. And until like one, so like actually to do those tournaments, I would actually sneak out of the house. Luckily, they didn't like track my movements all day because I was third kid. So at that point, you're not monitoring your kids at all. But I would like sneak out of the house, take the subway all the way down to Washington, D.C., you know, do all the tournaments there, come back, you know, at the end of the day on a Saturday or whatever, like with like a trophy in my backpack kind of thing. And one day, like my mom was like snooping or cleaning in my room, who knows? And she like, you know, went behind the trash can. It's like, there's like a dozen trophies back here. What is this? And she like called me over to be like, what, like kind of confronted me, like, what's this thing I discovered? And I was like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm good at chess. I'm the Maryland State Junior Champion. I also like won so and so, right? Like you just listed out a couple things. And then she got like super proud about it and she was telling all her friends. And I was like, you know what? That's crazy. Cause literally, you know, 2 years ago, you're like, stop playing chess. You're wasting your time, blah, blah, blah. And now that you see that there's trophies, it's kind of like a big deal for you to talk about. That's weird. But like I like that because it shows like how differently people can interpret these things. That for me, I was in it not because the trophies were actually particularly important to me. I like didn't even display them in my own room. It was just a thing that it would be rude not to take at the end of the thing if you won the competition. So I would just like take them, put them in the bag, and just put them in the trophy spot, right? And for her, it was like, you know, one step removed, she was interested in talking about my achievements. And only when it fit in the achievement frame was it something that, not only was she not, trying to talk me out of, she wanted to go tell her friends about. And I was like, this is a very interesting learning moment on like comparative. Now, that said, I'm not saying that she was undisciplined in her own life. She's disciplined on lots of things, but like that's like the difference in what each of us found valuable was very clear at that moment. Where it's like, oh, you thought it was a waste because I would like spend the time on these sorts of puzzles. Like, each chess position is like its own little puzzle. So it's like a game is like a whole bunch of puzzles unfolding toward an end. And it's like, oh, you thought it was a waste of time because I enjoyed like mentally working through these kinds of puzzles. But like, it only stopped being a waste of time when achievement was at stake. And for me, it was the opposite, where it's like, well, achievement was like whatever, whatever. It was like really being in the craft of using a mind in a sophisticated way. And the game asks you to use your mind in a sophisticated way.
So, quick question, because you probably surround yourself with other masters in their own right as well. Do you feel this mindset is common amongst those who, achieve certain level of mastery or multidisciplinary mastery or polymath of their own right? Do you see that as a common trait, or this is a unique, very rare trait to approach life
I
as a
think
class?
I think it's pretty prevalent in a lot of the people that have been successful. And not only do I not think it's rare, I think it's pretty teachable and, pretty doable by most people. I think like we just like taught people the wrong things, right? Like if you understand that if you understand that success is that feeling of being in your mastery discipline. And I have another talk, that kind of talks about like, don't try to create a masterpiece, just learn how to love your discipline long enough, that kind of it comes from it. And like it like changes the focus because until then people will torture themselves, including people that would have a great life in this kind of stuff. They'll be like, how come I can't create my masterpiece yet? How come this business isn't 10 times bigger than the last one I made yet? Right. And it's like, oh man, that's you like not loving your medium anymore. And like I think everybody that ends up being successful at least had, an extended period of time, if even if they aren't doing it like ongoing, where they really loved their medium. They like, Oprah really loved broadcasting. Beyonce really loved singing and dancing. Like you can kind of go through all of the greats, and there's like clearly a moment where they were loving their medium in a way that if you were just like sitting on the sidelines, if you were watching, whatever, Steph Curry like practice threes for a while, and he wasn't quite as good as he was today at it, then you'd be like, this is boring. Here you are on your eighth hour, like practicing threes. And like, are you even tall enough to be a serious player? Like all this sort of stuff that people could have said. But like, obviously that's a person that loves their medium enough where it's like, yeah, get up in the morning, let's try to sink some threes. And they just kind of kept going at it. And so if you are, one thing that's very common to the people that are successful is the quote unquote work that looks boring from the outside, they're fully engaged in it. It's like fully consumed them. They like a 3 hour practice of sinking a bunch of threes or trying to like blows by, right? It's not even a thing where like it feels like a great Saturday, as opposed to if you weren't in that mastery mindset, then you would look at that as like, oh, I got to practice another 3 hours today. Oh, I got to work on my book another 4 hours today. Oh, I got to do so. Oh, man, how am I going to find the time to do so and so? And it's like, yeah, at some point in that journey, then you need to have been in that state where kind of the time related to creating mastery became not too big a deal.
Now, you're also mentors to lots of young entrepreneurs, impact-driven entrepreneurs. Is this something that you do your best to teach them this, coach them this, or even just point towards the direction of this, or this is more of you you'll know it once, once you're in it kind of a thing. That's not so teachable.
Well, I mean, being an entrepreneur is an environment that gives you lots of moments to learn. So I think it's kind of in between, relative to your question, which is, if I were to try to sit down and lecture people for 3 hours on everything that you need to be an entrepreneur before you even started, that'd probably not be that useful. But like if you are an entrepreneur of any stripe, look, I mean, if I said some things, then you probably write down some good notes and maybe save you a little bit of time, but it won't be maximally useful. But like, when you do decide to be an entrepreneur in practice and not just the concept of wanting to like try it, then naturally all these occasions will pick up that will give you opportunities to practice mastery or not. And in those cases, like because I get to mentor people over an extended period of time, then there's lots of venues to be able to kind of bring it up where it's like, oh man, you've really gotten to mastery in the core engineering skill that is allowing you to really deliver the thing that the product is supposed to be. But there's still a lot to go relative to learning how to manage and motivate a team, like learning how to set a vision that inspires people. So great, let's dig into that a bit. Right. So like the framework of entrepreneurship is will like bring all the opportunities for learning, to your front door. And, you will decide which aspects of that learning you're going to take on directly, which aspects you're going to try to hire other people to go do, alongside you, which aspects you're just never going to do. And because of it, the business won't be able to do or express that kind of possibility, which by itself is not necessarily a problem. Like there's a lot of benefits to editing as well and saying, we'll do this, but not that. But, when people do that decision, I think if I'm mentoring an entrepreneur, then a lot of it is, well, are you trying to say we'll do this and not that because you've actually kind of learned from how the business is operating that this is the more important thing to be providing, like the bigger value creating part of what you can do? Or are you choosing this over that because you're just scared of trying this, or it feels too daunting, or you feel like you won't be successful at trying this, the thing that you've deprioritized? And, take some good listening on the part of a mentor to hear the difference there.
Are
Because,
there
yeah,
are,
go
are
ahead.
there common mistakes or barriers? Probably that's a better word that you see just over and over again. So let me give you some menus so you can pick from or
Mhm.
come up with ones that's outside of the menu. Some of them may be too confident or not confident enough, or too ambitious, but not ambitious enough, or, you know, uh, not having good ideas enough, or, not having enough mental fitness. They may have the, imposter syndrome or self-critic that's so overwhelming. Any common barriers that you see after mentoring hundreds of entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think literally everything that you said is a barrier, and they all have something in common, which is none of them have anything to do with the person you're trying to serve. So
Mm.
like a good entrepreneur is really well, I have a couple different takes on this. So one is called the 10-second MBA, because a bunch of people feel like, oh man, what if I can't start my business unless I have an MBA? Like maybe I should take a couple years out and get an MBA. And it's like, well, you could, and I'm not saying it would hurt at all. Like it might be useful to you actually. So not trying to say to not do it, but I can tell you in 10 seconds, like the main things that you need to learn from an MBA. And the 10-second MBA is the following. It basically says, if you want to create a successful business, there's really only 2 steps. Step 1 is do something, anything that meaningfully improves people's lives. Step 2, make step 1 cash flow positive. That's it. There's honestly nothing else to do to make a successful business. Now, if you are quote unquote working on your business and you're not doing one of those 2 steps, then you aren't working on your business. So a lot of times I will go talk with folks and it's like, yo, I got this idea, we're going to do blah, blah, blah. And he's getting excited about blah, blah, blah. And it's like, cool. Well, have you done step 1? Have you made something that meaningfully improves people's lives? It's like, well, this is absolutely going to improve people's lives because And that to me is like, oh, you didn't do step 1. Now it sounds, because they're talking about plans that could, they're not saying I meaningfully improve somebody's life. And the reason I like the 10-second MBA is that it actually is very grounding. Like most people have done step 1 in a bunch of different things in their lives. But like the folks that get wound up in their heads, they don't even get into step 1, even though they're quote unquote now trying to purposely work on a business. And what do I mean by that? It's like, have you ever, baked a pie? Have you ever helped, a neighbor put a fence up? Have you ever, like mowed a lawn? Have you ever, whatever? These are things that meaningfully improve people's lives. And if you think about all those things, there are people that decided to make that step 1 cash flow positive. So are there people that sell pies for a living? Absolutely. Are there people that mow lawns for a living? Absolutely. Are there people that help to put fences up or do construction work for a living? Absolutely. Did you make a cool website for yourself? Well, sure. That's the thing where you created some value for the world. That's a step 1. Have there been people that have made the step 2 on that, where they made that cash positive and it basically became a business in website design? Absolutely. So most of us have done a bunch of step 1s for a bunch of things in our lives. Whatever education path you took or whatever you do day to day in your life, most of us have some kind of step 1s that we've already done. And I can tell that people are on the wrong track when they have this big conceptual idea for what they will do, as opposed to just get into making the step 1 for a person. Just make the step 1 for any person and just see if it actually meaningfully improves their lives. This is kind of when a person ultimately becomes a high paid wedding photographer, but the first time they did it, they just took some prom pictures. And then the second time they did it, they're growing up. Second time they did it, they were just doing some freebie photos for the school newspaper. And next thing you know, it's they're just doing the step 1 over and over. And then eventually they're like, oh, I think I'm good enough at the step 1 that I can do the step 2 to this. I can put up my photography website, post on these different wedding boards. And next thing you know, I'm being interviewed from, by 10 different couples, and 3 of them said yes, for me to photograph their wedding. And now I got paid whatever, $8K a wedding for, in the next 3 months. That's going to be great money for me, And that's them doing the step 2 for their step 1, basically. So first, get out of the abstraction of the business that you're going to create, the benefit you're going to create, and just create it at a crazily small scale for 1 or 2 people. And just be like, okay, let me just actually deliver. Let me actually try to make something useful for you right now. Oh, I'm trying to start a new business, making croissants. Well, next Saturday, I'm going to bring over my latest recipes on it. If you're willing to eat 3 croissants, you are, I want to see if it, I can do something meaningful for somebody. And look, that's a very satisfying process. Honestly, it's way more satisfying than the anxieties, fears, overconfidence, underconfidence that people might have about doing a business. Because if you know how to make a croissant, you won't even get that much in your head about this. It's I know how to make a croissant. I'll just make one and bring it over. We're done, right? It's not oh, but am I hustling hard enough? And Gary Vaynerchuk said I should be working this many hours, or whatever, right? It's that's nowhere.
Yeah.
The actual thing is, did you make the thing and it improved people's lives? Now, once you make it a couple times, improve people's lives, well, now you do step 2. And a lot of what people learn in MBA is about step 2, where it's oh, if I'm making croissants, how do I source the ingredients at the right price? So kind of supply chain and sourcing. How do I like, set it up so that we are able to produce the product, at good quality? So manufacturing, quality control, product design, all that kind of thing. Once we have that, then how do I want to distribute it? Do I want to go sell it in local bakeries? Do I want to like open up my own storefront? Do I want to like have it as a B2C delivery service for people in the tri-state area, right? Like you will go work out these kinds of things on the step two. But at the end of the day, like you want to keep it all close to the ground. Like, don't let your business ideas like, you know, effervesce into abstraction. Like progress always comes from the most concrete version of it that you can think of. Because if people say like, oh my God, how am I going to make my croissant business like the next Betty Crocker and like take over the croissant market and like get 98% of croissant market share, this is all abstractions in your head. And if you actually keep it closer to the ground where it's like, well, right now we're at 0.0001% market share and we're moving like 85 croissants a month. So like, okay, but like everybody that we deliver it to like really likes our croissants. So like, what would it look like to bring it up to 300 a month? And that's a very like tractable next step. And you can really dig into the concrete details of that. And when you're in that, you're actually in the discipline of doing either step one or step two. In this case, step two for that.
Okay, I love that. So let's segue to At One
Mhm.
Ventures. Because At One Venture has this huge mission of helping humanity to be a net positive uh, to nature, right? And that in itself is a huge, in my opinion, my verbiage, huge ambition. How do you then concretize that, right? Help us bridge from, what did you say? Meaningfully improving people's lives. So meaningfully improve nature. And then how do you do that, sort of from small to large that way?
Yeah, so the kind of high level vision is help humanity become a net positive in nature. And then to kind of, get that real concrete, well, what's the main problem between the relationship between humanity and nature right now? I mean, if I went out there and just surveyed 100 people on the street and say, like, what do you think about nature? Honestly, people tend to be quite positive on nature. If I were to do a random survey, then, I'd probably end up between neutral responses to very much love nature responses. There's not a bunch of people I'd interview. It's like, I hate nature. Everything about nature is garbage. It's like, no. So in terms of personal sentiment, people already love nature. And yet we have a whole civilization that on average loves nature, but like is in totality destroying nature. So that leads to the interesting follow-up question. Well, why did the relationship get screwed up if everybody actually like at their core loves nature? Well, it's because we built an industrial economy that cannot help but destroy nature in the practice of providing the power for our homes, building the homes that we live in, creating the ways that we get around, creating the ways that we eat. We basically made an industrial economy that wasn't compatible with nature. So human beings just living in the world, like trying to interact with the economy, end up destroying nature, even though they love it. So that basically led us to the following way to go decompose the goal of helping humanity become a net positive nature. What you do is you take nature, you subdivide it into four physical categories that represent, the physicality of nature. It's air, water, soil, biodiversity. At least nature on Earth like needs those, are like draws off of those categories to exist. And then within each of those categories, you stack rank the industries that are doing the most damage. So for example, more than 90% of global water pollution comes from just four industries: agriculture, textile dyeing, paper and pulp, oil and gas. And it means that if you could change how those four industries relate to water, you could deal with over 90% of global water pollution. If you want to deal with that last bit, the less than 10% remaining, that's thousands more industries. So what our firm does is we zoom into the unit economics of how water is used in those industries that are creating the most damage to nature. And then we look for the disruptive deep tech that is going to bring much better unit economics. So actually the people that implement this will make a lot of money, but much better environmental economics. The way that water is handled is way more compatible with nature, either by avoiding pollution or even cleaning up water, depending on specifically the industrial process or product that you're talking about. And we kind of describe it as looking for something called the triad. The triad is basically a disruptive deep tech, which is ushering in radically better unit economics paired with radically better environmental economics. And that's what we're looking at to go disrupt the top of the stack rank in all the industries that are damaging air, water, soil, and biodiversity. So that's what our practical work is like. And you can see what the step one is. It's like, if we're able to go find the triad, then we are clearly benefiting people's lives because we are able to go and produce that product or service, but in a way that is way less, negative to nature, or sometimes positively generative to nature. The step one is also there because the better unit economics means that the people that were producing the old, producing in the older, dirtier way that was producing all the water pollution or air pollution or carbon emissions or methane emissions or whatever, are now able to, because of the better unit economics, they actually have a better time of the business, where for the same production level, they might end up with 50% more profits, right? So once again, that's kind of the step one being accomplished for them. And then the step two is like, having that all be cash flow positive. So the fact that we aim for better unit economics actually gives us a lot of leeway to make step two work. And that's effectively what we do with our companies. Like we take the winning unit economic. Our team is very good at shepherding things, winning unit economics through the manufacturing de-risk so they can then be offered at scale. And because the unit economics are better, then it's actually tends to be not too hard to get step two done, where we can find a way for the whole thing to be cash positive.
What are the triads again? So better
So disruptive
environmental
deep tech with radically better unit economics paired with radically better environmental economics.
I see. The third I missed was the disruptive deep tech.
Yeah.
So there's a particular, so you had in your talks, I can't remember which one you had laid out some of the current projects you're looking at and some of the ones that you are potentially looking at. And one area caught my attention, given that I'm a mindset coach, right? So awakening global consciousness.
Oh yeah.
Is there anything that you wanted to say there regarding what you have found, that provides deep tech and, better unit economics, better environmental economics, and so forth?
Well, the couple different things. So there is this kind of mechanistic frame, which is what I'm sharing right now about, disruptive deep tech, which oftentimes is like a new sort of material or a new sort of industrial process or a new sort of machinery that is able to go, for example, we invested in a company that completely eliminates wastewater from textile dyeing. So basically takes second largest water polluting industry and it would bring it down to zero wastewater. Well, I mean, to be fair, it generates a couple ounces of wastewater a week compared to metric tons per day. So, but it's down by a huge amount. And it also is able to do it at 2.5 to 3x better OpEx. So the amount that it costs to go dye a meter of fabric goes down by 2.5 to 3x. So you can kind of see how that ends up being a win everywhere. You got the triad, which is the new machine. That's the disruptive deep tech. The winning unit economics is 2.5 to 3x cheaper. And the win for the environment is you take the second largest water polluting industry and you bring it down to effectively nothing, ounces per week, kind of, and in that case, like don't pour it in the river then, just, dispose of it a different way. But, the kind of mechanistic stuff, like imagine that to be in a category. Your specific question about the, about expanding global consciousness, that referred to, a bunch of different things that I saw in the field where a slight mind shift in how we approach the problem basically created a lot of benefits. So one of those examples is from this work that I did with a company called Kingo that is providing solar electricity to all these folks that had never had electricity in their lives before in Central and South America. So I think they've already helped over 1 million people that didn't have access to electricity get access to electricity for the first time. So great. But like one of the things about this is the people that don't have this access to electricity that were getting it for the first time, most of them live on $1 or $2 a day. And they live in, environments where they weren't necessarily able to go pay for $100 object up front, right? Because it's like the solar electric box plus the panels or whatever, might run you like, a couple $100. Now, given that, what we ended up doing with that is we we updated the system so that you could pay as you go. So we made it so that instead of needing to come up with $100 up front or $150 up front, which is extremely hard to save when you only live off of $1 or $2 a day, then what we did is if you could pay a nominal amount, like $2 or $3, which people could successfully save up for, then we would deliver the box to your home. And in delivering to your home, you would now pay for the electricity as you go. But in order to go make it affordable, we priced a week of electricity cheaper than a week of the cost of candles, because that's actually how they were lighting their homes. And like just the fuel cost of candles was basically using a third of their income just to be able to have any light at all. So we like priced it so that immediately like this clean, light that was not generating all the smoke in your house and creating fire risk, all that sort of thing, was immediately cheaper. So instead of being a third of your weekly expense, and then it becomes a tenth of your weekly expense. But it kind of starts this task of you being able to go pay back the system over the course of a number of weeks and months. And in the process of doing that, we realized something really, really important, which is that if we could actually increase the cost of the device, but if we could increase the cost of a device in a way that made it way more durable in the field, so that instead of having a mean time to failure of 3 years, it ended up having a mean time to failure of 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, then actually it more than paid for itself. Actually, the calculation specifically was if we could add $5 to the box, if the $5 extended the likely lifetime of the box by more than 6 months, it would be way more than worth it. Now, the reason I'm sketching this all out is this is exactly the opposite dynamic of how most hardware manufacturers are currently incentivized to work, right? The reason that if you have a 4-year-old cell phone, it's a piece of garbage, is that like right now, the overall way that people are incentivized, and this is the consciousness and mind shift thing, is that the overall way that people are incentivized is a electronics retailer makes all of their money at the point of purchase. So what they want is they want the thing inside of the box to be as cheap as possible, so that the point of purchase, their margin is the largest it can be. And that's the kind of mind state that they're operating in. And in that mind state, it means, well, let's go through our component list and let's find the most expensive components. Let's replace them with cheaper ones. Even if the cheaper ones break down in less time, let's replace them with cheaper ones, because every time I can make that a little bit cheaper, my margin's a bit bigger at that point of sale. But when you flipped it around to say like, no, actually, if I can add $5 to the box and it ends up, and it could extend the life by more than 6 months, it's worth it. What we ended up doing was like working on the box in that way. We ended up adding $11 to the cost of the box, but actually extending the likely life out from 5 or 6 years to more like 40 years. And like, instead of the kind of hardware that like breaks in a year or two, or like even the most sophisticated things that we make, like will be garbage in, 5 years because of this kind of current consumer electronic model, then we were highly incentivized to make extremely reliable hardware that would last for decades. And at the end of the day, it didn't require different electrical engineering skills. Like literally the same engineering team made all those changes within a month and a half. It was not even a long task to actually get it done. But it required us to shift our minds from a mind state where we're incentivized around durability versus incentivized around maximum margins on day one. And that tiny tweak allowed effectively the same people with the same skills to go make something that really fit that market much better, and created something which has way more annuity value than just being able to go sell a product up front with 2% better margins because you filled it with cheaper parts, or you injected you did injection molded plastic for the casing as opposed to more durable material or whatever. Like, so that's an example of a mind shift. Another example of a mind shift comes from the zone of the rights of nature. So the first time that I gave the talk that you're referring to was in Ecuador, in Quito, in 2018. And that talk was given on the same weekend that there was a big conference related to the rights of nature. So there's this entrepreneurial conference that I was keynoting at. There was, the Rights of Nature conference. And Quito is not that big a town. So like there's a lot of overlap and people going between the two conferences. Now, the Rights of Nature was real interesting because the 2018 marked the 10-year anniversary of adding the rights of nature to the Ecuadorian constitution. Before then, Ecuador, just kind of had a constitution that didn't say that much about nature, but because of an economic crisis, they moved their currency from the peso to the dollar. So Ecuador still uses US dollars as their currency. And they also rewrote their constitution, and some stuff they wrote in the constitution. It's like a couple paragraphs. You can look it up online. It's maybe like 14 sentences or something. But a couple paragraphs inside of the Ecuadorian constitution refer to a river's right to flow, or a landscape's right to be able to restore itself. So for the first time ever, they basically, assigned nature to have rights, just like we assign humans to have human rights, or, a corporation might have corporate rights. Then they're like, hey, why don't we give some formal rights to nature? And that's like a nice thought until, it actually comes up in court and it gets tested in case law. And the 10-year anniversary was really notable because, yes, it got added to the Constitution 10 years prior. And in the subsequent 10 years, actually things had gone to court multiple times. And nature didn't win every single time, but nature won a bunch of those times. And effectively, it led to the foundation of real case law that meant that in the future, when people are looking at creating businesses in Ecuador, they now need to understand that unless they respect the rights of nature, that there's a real legal risk to the business. And things like that, at the end of the day, what was that? That was like 14 sentences. 14 sentences that basically reflected a slightly different way of looking at the world and treating the world relative to the relationship between nature and business. And, and just that shifted quite a few things for that country, just the 14 sentences. So I think that there is a lot that one can do when they kind of, examine how their mind states and frameworks of their current construction of the world are working for them. And then they start exploring what then becomes possible if you took a different mind state, right? When the Kingo team decided to focus on durability as opposed to upfront margins, completely transformed the product in a month and a half into something that was incredibly durable. The stuff's out in the South American jungles and Central American jungles, and it's a piece of electronic hardware. And there's almost no failures in those systems, even though they are in these hot, humid, very not conducive to electronics environments, because we kept, instead of looking at the most expensive components and replacing them with cheaper components, we stack ranked it by the components that were most likely to fail first, and we replaced them with more durable components. And it's a tiny mind shift. It's honestly the same engineering skills in either case, electronics design, packaging design, integration, unit testing. It's all the same skills. And we basically use those same skills with a slightly different perspective to lead to a massively different outcome.
So quick question there. What in your opinion, because you mentioned two beautiful examples of a mind shift, subtle but powerful, and it's going to have continual propagating effects going forward in the future. What does it take to shift someone's mind? Is it an ayahuasca ceremony? Is it a rapid prototype? Is it, hey, let me take you to the environment where you actually witness in the middle of it, this ocean of trash? Like in your example, in all the people that you work with, what have you found to be the most effective way to shift minds?
Got it. Yeah, so unfortunately, it depends on the person, though there is a bunch of phrases that might be helpful. So for example, my coach, Steve Chandler, has a phrase that it's not what a goal is, it's what a goal does. And, and it honestly doesn't even matter whether you achieve the goal or not. If it does the right thing to you, then it's great. And for some people, for example, the goal of our firm is to help humanity become a net positive nature. That's a big, ambitious goal. The thing that does for me is get me excited to go after the big, ambitious goal, right? And actually, I'm very realistic about what it's going to take for humanity to become a net positive nature. I think it's going to take about 200 to 500 years, which means it won't all happen in my lifetime. But the goal still inspires me to go out there and make the beginning part of that 200 to 500 years happen. Now, for a different person, if you were to trot out a huge ambitious goal like them, it might be daunting. They're like, I don't even want to get out of bed. That's way too big, right? And like the right form of goal in that it does the right thing as opposed to is the right thing. The right form of goal for them might be a really small goal, which is like, you want to write your book? Today you're going to roll out of bed and write 10 sentences. And they're like, okay, okay, that's doable. I can write 10 sentences today. Sure. Right. And that might be, even though that's a real small goal, and obviously 10 sentences is not a book yet, then like it does the right thing for that person. So I think like, instead of like trying to hang it on like, well, here's the perfect, construction. I mean, even when people have things like atomic habits, like here's exactly how you design your habits, or here's exactly how you design your whatever. I'm not against books like that. It's like, yeah, go ahead and look at all of it, try all of it, but then ask yourself, did it do the right thing? Right? It's because it's what it does, it's not what it is. And, whether it's doing the right thing, that goes back to the earlier part of our conversation of doing the interrogation of which goals are actually yours versus which are inherited, and which are inherited and unquestioned, and and unexamined versus which are inherited and examined and you don't even like them but you feel like you need to do them anyway, versus the ones that actually are kind of concurrent with the ways that one wants to live one's life. By the way, that is only discoverable by doing a bunch of different things that you don't like too. So like the whole idea of like sit down and design your whole life and like make a perfect plan, I don't mind those activities if it gets you off the starting line. But I think like one should like understand that most of your life is going to make sense in the rearview mirror. It won't necessarily make sense in the go forward plan, because you'll make the plan and it'll end up being a different thing. And like, I sometimes kind of state that dynamic almost like in a Zen koan type format where it's like, and the koan goes something like, ultimately, your life is going to be the answer to a question. And the purpose of life is for you to discover what the question is. Because you look at other people's lives, and we can go to extreme lives, right? It's like, okay, well, Hitler's life was basically it answers the question, what happens if you live an entire lifetime in hate? What happens if you live an entire lifetime in hate with a desire for power and something that completely takes you over? What does that look like? And it's like, okay, you answered the question, dude. And luckily you answered the question for a bunch of people to go see. And like it has meant that, yeah, actually your name is now representative of a path that most people don't want to take, because you answered the question so well, actually. And it means that like we will be answering all kinds of questions, including, living lives that sometimes are not well appreciated by humanity, but we still may be doing something useful in that process, even if it's giving an example of what not to do, right? Whatever. Elizabeth Holmes is trying to rebrand herself right now. Her life has been the answer to a specific question so far, which is like, what if you take the optimism of Silicon Valley and turn the words on top of themselves to like raise money, even if your thing doesn't work? Yep, her life is the answer to that question so far. So like, now that said, will that be the ultimate purpose of her life? She's obviously still alive, and like, there's many positive examples of this too, right? Like we can talk about the many positive examples as well. But I like that framing because it challenges a person and it challenges their sense of that kind of, look ahead goal orientation. Because a lot of suffering comes from the look ahead goal orientation. Now, if that sort of thing, if the goals do what they're supposed to do, then it actually almost won't matter whether you achieve that goal specifically, right? It'll get you onto a path where motion is happening and you're in your medium, you're in your discipline. So use whatever goals you need in order to be in your medium. But if you're setting goals out there that have you feel intimidated, keep you out of your medium, have you second guessing yourself, have you be in imposter syndrome, or having you be overconfident like Elizabeth Holmes, it's like, then you should take a step back and be like, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. right? At some point, she wasn't creating a useful thing in the world, and she kept pushing on that front, and it was worth stepping back at some point.
So you had mentioned that you actually have a coach, right? Someone who can basically fact check you or basically counteract you and help you find your own blind spots. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
I personally, I'm a little biased because I'm a coach, but I believe that everyone deserves a coach because they can help us guide us towards the life that we want to create, right? So inside of that, is there anything else for you to say, hey, on my life to answer this question yet to be discovered, what allies can I put in place to help support me along the way to help me find that question that's beautiful and that's unique to my own life?
Yeah, and the point of the construction is you don't even need to spend that much of your life answering the question. Your life will be the answer. And
Mm.
it'll be nice for you to it'll be a nice feeling if you look back on your life and you understand the question
So
that you
so
answered
so
in your life. But
so
even if you didn't, you could still live a full-on life. But sorry, go ahead.
so not even any kind of contemplation at all, just like, hey, here it is, and just live your life, and then eventually you look back, you're like, oh, my life is ultimately about this. Don't even contemplate and think about and
You will have local contemplations that will push you into the next thing. But like
mm.
all I'm saying about this is it doesn't need to all add up as you're going forward. In the forward view mirror, or it's not even a mirror, like in the forward windshield, it doesn't need to add up. When you look behind, you will see how it added up, right? Like in the particular work that I do today, like it actually connects stuff that was like fully not part of my career for most of my life. Like when I was a kid, I was obsessed with watching nature documentaries. I like, I wanted to be a naturalist because I loved drawing things and I loved nature. And I was like, what better job than to go out into nature and like draw plants and animals and like, do what a naturalist does, right? So like I was very excited about that, between the ages of like 5 and 12. And that said, it never became part of my formal academic career. So like I was out there like fully doing things that were more like shipping software to a billion people and having people have better search and email and just whatever, a lot of things in my career. And obviously that has nothing to do with being a naturalist. But like if you fast forward to now, then yeah, literally everything I do in my work like overlaps with things that I learned when I was, between the ages of like 5 and 12. And now I've like really extended upon that knowledge. Now, that would not even be a thing if I was talking about the forward view, like forward look out the windshield as to my career so far. If you like asked me 10 years ago, I wouldn't even mention that like wanting to be a naturalist as a kid like had anything to do with my work, on a self-driving car or my work, like on web search or email or whatever, right? Like it doesn't seem to fit. But like looking backwards, I understand that I'm exactly the right person to be doing this type of work, both in terms of the high tech invention pedigree, as well as the operational skills to run a large scale technology business, as well as, the deep, love and commitment to nature. And I look around at a lot of other people that are starting venture firms, kind of, adjacent to or in my sector. It's like, yeah, that person doesn't really have it. I mean, they don't have that deep love of nature, or they're finding out now that not all soils work the same. And I was like, well, I mean, you would have known that if this was just a thing that you were obsessed with and loved as a child. Like you would have seen it just from how you interact with soil as a child.
Mm.
And yet like we have folks that are backing things and putting crazy money into, I'm not going to call out any specific company, but billions have gone into very ill-conceived ideas on how nature works. And it's because those fund managers don't have a deep love of it. It wasn't in them. So like I can only mention that looking backwards though, because I otherwise would have said, well, those 7 years, like watching all those nature programs and reading the National Geographic and trying to learn some basic things about ecology and biology and like the, cell function and all that kind of thing, getting a microscope and like analyzing pond water and like whatever. Like that stuff would be nothing in my career history until this moment when it was obvious why I spent so many years on that.
Was there an aha moment, by the way, when you're just, being teaching rapid prototyping and then all these things, and just like, you know what, I'm gonna raise a fund to tackle, deep tech to support to help humanity become net positive to nature. Like, was there like a light switch moment, or was it more of a, gradual
No,
illumination?
the aha moment was before that. And I, as mentioned before, it's like our lives are defined by the tragedies and triumphs. And people really like to focus on the triumphs because those are the things that you want to post on social media or put on a resume or talk to other people about. But I actually feel that like people's lives paths are way more shaped by tragedy than triumph. Because the triumphs are typically along somebody else's criteria of what good and bad is, of what success and failure is. So they're not totally yours. Like society created, these criteria, and you just happen to end up, top 30 under 30 or whatever, list you're talking about, right? In those criteria. But like your tragedies are yours. And in this particular case, like, we had a house out in Hawaii that was near an astoundingly beautiful coral reef. And, that coral reef is still the most beautiful thing that I've seen with my own eyes personally. I've obviously seen pretty amazing things on videos and TV and all that sort of thing, but like in terms of my direct relationship to nature and like spending time around it and being around natural beauty, it's still the most beautiful thing that I've seen with my own eyes. And I watched that reef go from every color of the rainbow and life coming out of every pocket and pore to gray and brown and no life in less than 2 months.
Wow.
And that tragedy basically spurred me to ask questions about like, hey, well, you're working on a self-driving car, you're working on augmented reality glasses, you're working on, a contact lens that can measure glucose levels, you're working on new artificial intelligence that's currently powering image searches and voice searches. All sounds very exciting. But what if the skills that you have are going to be important for nature making it through this passage? And all the things I just listed could be invented 100 years from now and life would still go on. But if we did not deal with these issues in terms of our relationship to the natural environment within the next 100 years, those things will not go on. They will be extincted, and it will be many millions of years, if ever, for them to re-evolve and reappear on this planet. And we're making decisions for the next 10 to 20 million years right now in the next couple of decades. So the era of technology is going to keep on going, and somebody will make an even better self-driving car, in the year 2200. That's freaking great. Congrats. But like those things could be put off to that time period. And like, a lot of stuff that we're doing to nature right now could not be put off to that time period. And it's like that tragedy basically forced me to, reflect on my own skills and ask the question, well, what are we doing about this relationship to nature? And how good is the work so far? And as I like surveyed the world, and I'm not saying that there aren't good people pushing really hard to make good things happen, but I was after taking sabbatical from Google and just like looking at, exactly what this ecological damage was around the world, it was clear to me that what we were doing wasn't going to make it. It wasn't going to happen soon enough, well enough, at the right scale, displace enough of damaging industry, wasn't going to do enough. And we were going to end up, we're on a trajectory still to like extinct, about 2/3 of everything on the planet by the year 2100. And I think that's already a very big deal. But we need to get off of that trajectory. And we need people that are kind of thinking big enough to actually swing a trajectory as opposed to, just kind of launch the next version of a particular product in a particular industry.
Mm.
So I was hoping that I could just find the people that were doing that and just like work with them or advise them or hire them or whatever. But the more that I looked around, the more that I was like, I don't think that there's something that's taking a strong enough swing at this. So yeah, that basically led to me like learning how to do venture in order to take this swing. So,
Mm.
that was a bit of a plan, but it wasn't like an aha, like I was teaching enough rapid prototyping to do it. I actually was teaching rapid prototyping because it was both a skill that I learned that I think that could create a lot of benefit in the world, and it has, so that's great, and lots of positive feedback from people that I've taught. But it was also a very expedient way to go make the money that I needed to make to be able to even afford to be in venture capital. I don't think that
Mm,
people totally understand this, but if you are a managing partner at a fund, then you typically need to put in 1 to 2% the value of the fund in order to run a fund. So
mm,
we have a 150 million fund one. You know, we are almost done raising a 300 million fund two. That's like $3 to $6 million that like I personally need to put in order to like be allowed to be a fund manager, basically.
mm,
And then, you know, because of that, we shouldn't be surprised that most of the people in venture capital are, you know, white men that were already rich, right? Like you almost needed to be that in order to like have an extra 3 million, an extra 5 million hanging around. Now, I was able to make that kind of money by teaching rapid prototyping for a number of years, and that all worked out fine. But like, but up until then, like I couldn't have done venture capital basically, not from the financial perspective. I couldn't have done it.
mm, mm. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, that's so much more to Tom Chi than I realized. And thank you for sharing your childhood, passion around nature. So a question for you, Tom, because you are a doer, a inventor through and through, right? That's in all the things that you're interested in. Your life is a life of craft, and then one of the crafting includes inventing things. Was it difficult for you to be more of an at a length investor where you're not actually now hands dirty in the invention itself? Was it require some kind of a mental shift for you? Or do you still get the itch of like, I want to start in this technology solving this problem in these four pillars that our firm is interested in solving?
You know, I think you can continue to do your craft, even even if your professional lens kind of changes a bit. And I think first off, the way that we do venture capital is a lot more, um, operationally thoughtful, kind of is happening at an expert level compared to a lot of folks only get to the depth of like, oh, I'm pattern matching the trends and like this kind of AI is going to be super hot. And it's like, well, give them a background. It's like I can actually deconstruct the way you're approaching the AI and we can talk about it in some real depth. So that scratches the itch a bit. But I would say that like, yeah, I still build things, as just part of my life. And like it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm being paid to invent things is the main thing I'm being paid for, like I was in some of my previous jobs, or running teams that invent things. Though investing in teams that invent things and running teams that invent things are already starting to have, enough of an overlap where, because if you are useful enough to the entrepreneur, then you kind of become like an extended team member where they like come to you for inputs on particular parts of the build or the manufacturing de-risk, or the go to market, where you're effectively getting to have the kind of conversations that you would have if you were on the team, but times 50 things in the portfolio. So like that is still, I think just as satisfying in terms of like just being able to use that skill and do some contribution there. But I still like to build things, with my own hands at home and stuff, and just muck around like making different robots and different, fun things to make basically. And
Mm,
occasionally I'll have a thing where it's like, oh, that could be a bigger thing. Though in practice, like, I would because I have like full-time responsibilities on this fund, then they need to be more like side projects. Though even my side projects are a bit interesting. Like I helped to kick off a team that is building a robot that has actually has already been the first robot in history to plant live corals back into a coral reef, and also
whoa,
the first robot in history to plant live seagrasses back into a seagrass meadow.
whoa.
So it's like even my like hobby time stuff is like, oh, that's still pretty interesting. Could I make it move faster if that was my only project? Absolutely, sure. But I got to go help 50 teams, like, because there's a lot of frontiers for reshaping that relationship between humanity and nature. And I honestly don't think that we get there unless more people have that lens of not needing to trade off either, right? Where you basically, because there is this kind of artificial lens where it's like, oh, I think it'd be more economically successful or it could be better for the planet. And I'm going to say 85% of the time, that's not even the right framework. You can actually get both if you don't start from a framework of trade-offs. If you just, start from a framework of it needs to be above this bar on all the attributes, right? That's actually a more straightforward framework, and then you don't end up investing in things where it is a trade-off. You've already like made from the beginning investments in things where they don't need to intrinsically be traded off, and it gives you a lot more freedom just to like make that successful on behalf of the planet, as opposed to make that successful in spite of the planet. So I think there's some mind shifts to be done there. I think we need a lot more people like kind of coming at it with that lens, like looking for scalable things with better unit economics, as opposed to trying to guilt everybody into paying a green premium in order to make things work. Look, I'm fine if that happens in some products, but that's not the way that foundational industry is going to shift. Because consumers can make slightly different choices, but the folks that like rolled your steel or extracted your aluminum from bauxite, or like grew your food or whatever, they're just trying to make the numbers work at a basic level.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get to like show off like the vegan leather bag at a brunch or something. Like, no, they actually just need the core things to work at a sensible economic level. And the more investors that are in there also trying to improve the unit economics while improving the relationship to nature, then I think that gets us on a way better path than how we have been applying the money.
Beautiful. I have to ask you this question. I know that you made a beautiful articulation of why ChatGPT is neither artificial nor intelligent. So if you don't mind recreating that metaphor real quick, that I think people will really appreciate that.
Yeah, so we have this marketing term, artificial intelligence, and I call it a marketing term because it's like an umbrella term for a bunch of different techniques that have been developed over the years. And a bunch of those techniques I have some overlap with, so I can speak to them a bit. But there is natural language processing, there's part of speech analysis, there's sentiment analysis, there's n-gram analysis, there is co-occurrence sort of analyses. And a lot of these things are contributing to, and also machine learning. A lot of these things are contributing to what we are now calling large language models, and then, even more vaguely AI. And you look at this as like, well, why wouldn't people like actually share some of the stuff that it is? Well, it's because the stuff that it is obviously not intelligent. And if I keep it at the marketing level, then I can kind of, potentially get you on board that that you might believe that it's intelligent, even if it's not. But if you actually just share the decomposition of techniques that you're using, then everybody will be like, well, it's obviously not intelligent. It's very straightforward to point out that's not intelligent. But the kind of abstraction allows people to kind of believe a thing that's not true. Now, the reason that it's not artificial is that most of what ChatGPT or systems like that are doing is using natural intelligence. And what I mean by that is they are mining from things that human beings actually wrote. So natural intelligence produced all the training data, basically. And then they permute, things that come from natural intelligence. So if 50 million people wrote like billions of sentences and all those sentences are coherent, if I like permute some of those sentences and I'm able to kind of put them back, back in front of you, you will read a bunch of sentences like, oh, those sentences make sense, of course, because they were written by humans in the first place. And then there is like a additional like ascribing of intelligence that happens. So like we've seen all these articles recently where this journalist played with ChatGPT for 3 hours and they tried 60 conversations, and here's like the 2 conversations that freaked them out. And that to me is like, no, actually in the curation of choosing the 2 to publish out of 60, you also did an act of infusing intelligence into the thing, but that was your intelligence, not the system's intelligence. It's almost like if you had a dice and you kept rolling the dice 60 times and it came up a six like four times out of 60, and you wrote an article about those four times. You basically said, I have a magic dice that only rolls sixes. It's like, no, guy, you curated it. Like, it would be quite different if like every single conversation that you had was a deep, profound conversation. Maybe there's something more there then. But people are basically cherry picking the things that are kind of advancing this hypey narrative. And I think we're going to discover a couple different things given this. We're going to understand that there's way more hype than substance here. Hopefully we understand that soon enough, because if we don't understand it soon enough, then we're going to go put a tool that is not capable of doing what we think it's capable of doing. We're going to put it in the wrong places and give it too much responsibility or the wrong responsibilities. And we've actually already seen that. Like, the most sophisticated AIs in the world right now are trading stocks and serving you ads. And the trading of stocks, it's not doing it responsibly. Like, we've had dueling algorithms create these these flash crashes where the cost of, coffee beans worldwide might go down by 90% in 100 milliseconds. And do you think it's because everybody in the world decided, oh, we're not interested in coffee anymore in 100 milliseconds? Of course not. Like, that's like dueling artificial intelligence being insanely dumb and actually creating actual negative impacts in the economy. Because, if you might be thinking, oh, it just hurts some stock traders, they had a bad week because they had a lot of, stuff in coffee futures and it went down or whatever. But it actually hurts a lot more people than that. There are folks that might have been, in the global south that might have spent the last 2 or 3 years converting their lands to be able to grow coffee. And this is like the first harvest season that they're going to be able to pay back their investment. And the week that they're trying to send it to market, there's a flash crash and they're able to get a third of the value that they had hoped to get from it. You may have actually ruined that farmer's life because of a AI that was just kind of dueling with other AIs and played chicken and created a flash crash. So like, we basically put AI on the spot where it can actually harm the physical economy already, which is a great example of believing that it's smarter than it is and putting it to do a job that it's not, cannot be fully responsible for. And relative to serving ads, then ads affect the cognitive landscape, like ads like affect our opinions, ads affect, ads hope to affect our desires, ads and misinformation, which is another place where we're using these advanced algorithms, can absolutely like confuse people. The people that were storming the Capitol on January 6th, if you like look at their online history, it's like, well, I get why they believe what they believed. And also, these are algorithms run amok, basically. So like, when we put AI in the wrong places, we can pollute our interior mind landscape, as per misinformation or advertising. And we can also destroy our physical economy as per flash crashes and dueling algorithms and high frequency trading. And I think this should be the warning shot that every time that we've already gotten ahead of things and kind of put the quote unquote most sophisticated things in place, it actually hasn't been creating value on balance. Right? Like, this is the danger of us believing that the stuff is more capable than it is and already like rushing to put it in these spots. So I think we got to like be a lot more thoughtful, take 2 steps back and first unpack the frame AI into what is it specifically? What are the subcomponents that we're talking about for this use case? When you look at those subcomponents and you realize that an Ngram model is clearly not smart and clearly does not understand your customer service request, and because of it is not necessarily going to be a good customer service, algorithm, then yes, we'll have a way more nuanced conversation about it, as opposed to, oh, ChatGPT is about to go take all the customer service jobs. Like, that's not a conversation. We're like, literally do not even have enough information on the table to have a thoughtful conversation about it. So let's unpack the word AI and say what it specifically is for this use case. Within that use case, let's break it down even further and say, like, well, what net happens in the world if we do it this way? On one hand, somebody sold, people on high frequency trading and these algorithms to go do it. And it sounded like a good idea when they started it. But like, people didn't like either pay attention to when it started breaking down, or they also didn't have some of the conversations ahead of time where it's like, well, what happens if we put it in this spot? is there any other things that we should be thinking about other than maybe we could make a little bit more money if we advertise in this way or traded stocks in that way? So we got to stop, on a bunch of these fronts and be more considerate in terms of what actually happens if we start making a bunch of money in that way.
Hmm. I love the cautionary note that you take because I myself am an optimist by nature. So I love the possibility that it brings, right? Oh yeah, this is good now, and 6 months in or whatever. Imagine what it could be when it actually has more intelligence. You know, so I appreciate the sort of the flip side. I'm thinking about like the long-term impact because I wasn't thinking about high frequency trading or ads impacting our cognitive landscape. To me, um, those are not something I pay attention to. So I appreciate your broad landscape of looking at all these things
I mean, I would feel differently if all the places we have rolled out AI and advanced algorithms, like everything was just going great, but it's not going great for the places that we've put it. Of course, we've also made autonomous killing machines, right? Like we have like put guns onto, robotic vehicle platforms and like given them all net, and a lot of the stuff is teleoperated and remote operated. So like a Predator drone or, a iRobot, like roadside bomb diffuser or whatever can be remote operated. But a bunch of them either have the ability to, or you can just flip a bit. And honestly, the robot will make decisions for itself on like, what targets are dangerous targets, all that kind of thing. So like this is us. It's not inevitable that we need to make it in that way. It's not inevitable that like the discoveries that we make or the algorithmic advancements that we make need to be packaged in that form for that task. And this is why it's important when people say like AI is coming, the next phase or whatever, that basically like depersonalizes the agency of it into what's coming anyway. So you just got to get out of the way. There are no decisions to make about what we decide to make versus not because it's coming anyway. And I would push back on that narrative strongly because very specific people, who were paid in particular ways, and then we end up supporting those businesses after they get made in this way, decided to make it in that way. The AI is certainly not, it has no agency in itself to go make itself. So it has no agenda other than human agendas on how humans are looking at making money right now. And when we depersonalize it as if AI has its own agenda and it's getting smarter by itself, then we actually create a cover story or a smokescreen that allows people that basically are making terrible choices for society to be like, well, we had to do it because China was going to do it, or we had to do it because like AI was advancing so quickly. So like somebody like us had to do it, like the good guys. And yeah, I recognize we're making billions of dollars and maybe it's causing some harm now, but we're the good guys. And it's like, I don't know, guys, like maybe you created that narrative so you could, abdicate actual responsibility. And maybe you created that narrative because it allows you to go push off any pushback as to why are we creating this and why are we creating this particular thing now?
One last question, my friend. How do you keep track of all these ideas and frameworks and factoids and stories? Do you use some kind of note-taking system, My Palace? Like, how do you keep track of all these in your mind? Or you're just uniquely gifted where you have perfect memory, so you can just keep track of all of them.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I do like write a lot of things on paper. So I think that maybe it commits to memory a bit better as I do that. Also, like because I'm a public speaker, then when I do a big chunk of work in a particular area, there'll be moments where I want to resolve it down to a talk that can be given to other people. So like that kind of
Um,
curation and reflection act kind of puts it into narrative frames. Like a mind palace is effectively a type of narrative frame about spatial geography that allows you to go and recite things more easily. So I certainly don't have a photographic memory or a perfect memory, but I have a very good memory, just like most people do, for things that happen in stories. So if I were to like grill you, it's like, what's the plot of Titanic? And it's like, oh, well, no, no, no. And you just like talk me through the whole story. Okay, what's the plot of, whatever, like Transformers, just like what some other movie, right? And it's like, yeah, no, like people literally can recite the plots of hundreds of movies that they've seen. And it's because they got some kind of perfect memory. It's like, no, it's because movies are set up in a narrative structure and the human mind is quite good at story and narrative. So it's just a highly portable form. So
Mm.
when I need to go look, when I write things down, then they end up kind of being linear and they're like in words. So it starts to be the origins of narrative. And then when I need to go give talks about things, then I am kind of expressing a thing in a narrative form. So it kind of becomes a very easily memorable story for me.
Mm. Beautiful. What's one thing you want people to leave with after this 2 hour, download of Tom Chi?
Yeah, I mean, like related to our previous point, I sometimes summarize like what's happened in the last couple hundred years is we spent most of the 20th century, strip mining the physical resources of the planet. And you can look at tar sands and you can look at, like mining sites and you can look at a bunch of different things, clear cut forest, and you'll get what it looks like to strip mine the physical resources of the planet. And it looks like we're spending most of the 21st century potentially strip mining the cognitive resources of the planet, where it's like, look, there's only so many people, finite number of people on the planet, a finite set of coherent thoughts we're going to have in our lives, before we die. And right now we're kind of making it free game for companies to go and insert themselves and do a bunch, in terms of strip mining those cognitive resources. And I would say that like it doesn't need to be this way. Like we basically that is a form of capitalism that we got into a bit, and we can go decide that that's not a form of capitalism that we want to keep doing. Right. So for example, because we've outlawed things in the past, like, for example, organ harvesting is outlawed worldwide. And one could say, like, well, I mean, it's my kidney. I could sell it if I wanted to. It's like, see, it's capitalism. But there's some lines that we drew that basically said, no, 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 some things need to be outside of this frame. And I think like when you go and look at the arc of how society is developing and how you build your own career within it, just remember that these are decisions that we can make, even if the macro is kind of pushing in a different way. These are all decisions that we can make. There's AI in a particular form is not inevitable. Like the strip mining of the cognitive resources of the planet is not inevitable. The destruction of, most of the species on the planet is not inevitable. Like these things can take a different route, as we go into the future. And honestly, most of these things that were created weren't created by enormous numbers of people. They weren't created by 50,000 people. They were created in small product teams that, were probably 5 to 20 people. And understand that, as a creator, your skill, might be extremely valuable to creating the world that you want. And a lot of it's going to happen in teams that are 5 to 20, which are very approachable to either join or start or be a part of in some way. And given that, like, if we are thoughtful about the kind of world that we're trying to create and we actually stay in the medium of like being in and around those teams, being a good contributor to such teams that are like lighting the path down other pathways other than this kind of inevitable one, which is like capitalism eating itself and destroying the planet in the process, like, and destroying our cognitive resources in the process, like, then we can start to go shift that trajectory to something different. And we're already starting to see it a bit, but we need that times a million.
Mm.
And we need that times a million so that it isn't the default sensibility that, oh, the way to make a business in a capitalist society is blank. Like, I also caution against this kind of thought process of like, oh, you just need to tear down capitalism and just figure out what's next. I think the best frame for it is we need to compost late stage capitalism, right? Just like nature like makes use of all the nutrients that was in the old thing to create the new thing, then let's, look at what was useful in late stage capitalism and let's look at what needs to just kind of fall apart in late stage capitalism. And let's do what composters do. Let's like redirect the nutrients. Let's create it in new forms. Let's, like have a burgeoning across the forest floor of all these opportunities so that that new life can come to the surface and be fed in the sunlight. And then, yeah, like let's build toward an ecosystem where a lot of folks are benefited and nature is benefited as opposed to just the smaller localized sense of success.
Mm. Hey, Tom, I so appreciate you just being who you are. We cover a lot of topics, but it is no surprise to me. We cover from near-death experience to our connections to the universe to the mental constructs of achievement-oriented versus following the intrinsic desire versus the mimetic desires. We cover enlightenment. We cover the frustration of someone who is aspiring to make a big impact in the world and what to do, what to follow tactically. We cover entrepreneurship, especially impact driven entrepreneurship. And ultimately, coming down to this, comes down to sovereignty. We get to choose what we want to devote our life force towards and change accordingly. I so appreciate you, just the wide ranging of conversations that we had, and ultimately just being who you are, being a great example of what it means to live a life of craft, as you so beautifully articulated. So thank you so much for being here on Noble Warrior.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time today.